So it is a question and answer. We're going to go for 30 minutes or so. We'll stop promptly at 12:45. And I'm going to start the ball rolling, Oren, by saying, this is a remarkable book, and I do really commend it to you as well worth purchasing. And what I think is amazing is not simply the quality of the narrative and the research that's been done, but those compelling images in the middle, which are photographs of key places and persons that is discussed in the text. So, Oren, let's just start with the question, to what extent do you want to say that William Holland Wilmer is responsible for saving the church in Virginia and single-handedly creating the structures that enabled the church to go on? Because he's clearly a very key player. That's a major theme of the book. But, how much credit do you think he deserves compared to other players?
One of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because I didn't think he was getting enough credit. He died so young that he was eclipsed by the folks who lived much longer, most notably his friend, Bishop Meade, who became the third bishop of Virginia, lived so long that we not only have sketches of him, paintings of him, a silhouette, but also a photograph, which is pretty amazing, actually. So to be clear, William Holland Wilmer didn't single-handedly save the church in Virginia, but certainly one of the key leaders in making it happen. And I can say about there are four revivalists, I call them. I have to give Bishop Meade, William Meade, credit. He was, of the four, the only Virginian, and he was the one to recruit William Holland Wilmer and his friend Oliver Norris, who would follow him at Christ Church, become the rector of Christ Church. They came to Alexandria essentially about the same time, both from Maryland. They were ordained by Bishop Claggett to the diaconate and the priesthood on the same day. And so remember, in terms of our own St. Paul's history, this was only 3 years after this congregation was founded, and Alexandria was a very small community. And so one of the things that helped heal that rift and reconcile our churches was that these two best friends came to Alexandria at the same time. So those two Episcopal evangelical preachers came. And then the fourth was the one that they all three recruited, Richard Channing Moore, who would be the second bishop of Virginia. He came from New York, and they lobbied him hard to come. And in fact, he was so happy in New York and was so skeptical about being the Bishop of Virginia that he did not even step foot in Virginia until after he was first elected bishop and then had a job, and he was the new rector of the new monumental church in Virginia. So those four are the key players. But before I stop, I want to talk about the many clergy. There weren't that many, but they worked really hard, often without compensation, serving many parishes. And the congregations that didn't have clergy, there were lay readers who led those congregations in this very difficult time in the church's history. And hats off to the women of the Episcopal Church in Virginia at that time. I am convinced that the church survived because of household prayers. Anyone who could read and had a prayer book could lead household prayers and shape and form disciples of Christ in their homes. I think that's what helped make this happen. And because William Holland Wilmer and Meade and the others were smart to tap into that resource.
Now, it's interesting. So of course, one challenge one always has on occasions like this is I've read the book and most of you haven't. So I think it's helpful if we sort of just fill in the sort of main contours a little bit. So you're talking about the early 19th century. You've gently told persons from Great Britain that they're no longer welcome in the United States of America in the latter part of the 18th century. You've got this denomination that's got this close affiliation with the Diocese of London, literally, and with the Church of England generally. And we're, for many, on the wrong side of the Revolutionary War. So you've got this precipitous crisis in just numbers, presence. We were the denomination not to belong to. That was one of the challenges. And then you're talking about relatively sparsely populated Virginia, mainly farm tracts around here, relatively small populations. And then you've got this guy who lives only 41 years.
44.
44 years. So just fill in the main contours. I mean, he how many universities does he found?
It's amazing, really. It's amazing.
And incidentally, I don't want to be critical, but you're a bit of a slacker. Because, as you'll tell people in a moment, this guy did so much, and basically you've been sitting around
It's
here.
absolutely true. And in addition to his, professional life, which was amazing, and to think about just how you got places. He was the rector of St. Paul's and the founding rector of St. John's Lafayette Square. How do you do that on a Sunday morning? I have no idea. In addition to all that, he was widowed twice, married 3 times, and had 8 children. So pretty amazing.
And a link with William and Mary.
Yeah, so he left here. His great passions were pastoral ministry and education. And it became clear very quickly to the reformers that the way that we're going to turn this church around, which had every reason to fail, was the training of leaders, the forming and shaping and training of leaders. That's why founding a seminary was so important to them. And so they set off to do that and really change the course of our history here. Do you think about, we were on the losing side of the war. Clergy had to pledge allegiance in their ordination vows to the monarch. The glebe lands were taken away, their salaries were taken away. They used to be paid by taxes, and now the church had to have voluntary giving. It's in this era that pew rents became the norm to try to keep churches alive and to have some income coming in. It was just one challenge after another, and these folks were just relentless and passionate about mission and believed that the Episcopal Church had an important voice in this new nation, and that really put together the best of the Reformed traditions, our Catholic traditions, and the traditions of a new nation that was more democratic. So the American church would be more democratic than any other in the Anglican Communion, and it's because of their hard work, blending it together. And Welmer, in addition to everything he did in Virginia, was the president of the House of Deputies of this new national church and helped to form and shape and bring things together to make this institution alive today.
Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to encourage you just to read a paragraph of the book. This is on page 38. And the question I want to ask you at the end of it is, do you like this guy? So if you start with the sentence, "It is said that."
You would pick this paragraph. It is said that Meade, Wilmer, and Norris even refused to witness social dancing. There is a story about Wilmer being approached by a bride at her wedding reception to ask if he would join in the dancing. She had heard that he was a dancer in his youth and wanted him to join in the celebration. He is said to have responded that he had now put away childish things and suggested that she do the same. He then proceeded to transform the party into a prayer meeting. Get this, to the delight of all in attendance. At least that's how the story goes. Yeah, they were tough, and it's interesting. Bishop Richard Channing Moore, who was in New York, was very much of the same evangelical ilk. And to give them their due, remember that they had seen lives destroyed by alcohol and gambling. They're trying to build a church, trying to build a new nation. So for them, there really was no middle ground. There was no sense of moderation. You just didn't do these things. And as a Christian, they made it very clear that's what you were taking on, or you couldn't receive communion. And there were people often turned away from the communion rail for being part of these, playing cards even. So it's interesting, though, when Richard Channing Moore became bishop, and they tried many times to kind of put this into the canons of the church, to make it doctrine of the church, it failed every time. Virginians loved their amusements. They loved going to the track. They liked having a drink every now and again. And so, like, Richard Channing Moore even confessed toward the end of his life that he enjoyed a glass of wine every now and again. So that was a non-starter for many, but for those reformers, it was really clear that they needed to, this was one way they saw to build up the church. And remember that they're trying to hold together this Reformed English evangelical tradition, but also at the same time, the Second Great Awakening is sweeping through this part of the world, the Middle States and the South, where these other denominations were just blossoming left and right. So they picked up some of that fervor in their movement.
And actually, elsewhere, he's described as austere and a little scary.
Yeah, humorless, actually.
Humorless.
Yeah, it's interesting. The people who knew him and describe him, you get the sense that he's sort of distant in some ways, but clearly engaging. It's amazing to think of this parish grew to the extent so quickly when he became the rector. They almost immediately started plans for building this church just to hold the people. Starting a new church in Washington, getting Benjamin Latrobe to design both of them. And he was in extended arguments with many people, but in the end, I think there was this deep love and respect that these folks had for each other, that in spite of their sometimes prickly personalities, they had a common mission and they were determined to see it through.
Now, we heard from the Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress Williams that one challenge with genealogical research is you're not always sure that you're going to be pleased with what you find. And of course, you did find that he was by no means an abolitionist, and he was a person who held enslaved persons. So just talk a little bit about that part of the...
Yeah, one of the things Dr. Fentress Williams said today was that we sometimes don't look into that history because we fear what we might find, and that's certainly honest in my case. I've been working on this and this idea for as long as I've been here, really wanting to tell this story, and then when to discover that he was born in Chestertown, Maryland. There were 11 enslaved people in his household when his father died. We know it because of his will. We know that when he came to Alexandria, he had to have a witness attestation. He brought 2 children, Maria and Henry, who were 10 and 12, 2 enslaved children with him. And he had to attest in the court that he did not buy them the African slave trade that had been abolished at this point. And he had to say that he was not going to sell them when he came. We don't know if they were household servants. We don't know anything about that. What we do know, and as the story unfolds, and I won't spoil the bottom line, but let me just say that his understanding of slavery and his participation in the institution of slavery was much more nuanced than just that. And maybe I will tell you that when his son was writing about his father, and this is the son who became the Bishop of Alabama, he said, my dad had a great job at St. Paul's in Alexandria for a very long time. He commanded a very high salary, but when he died young at 44, he left the family destitute because he was buying and freeing slaves.
And he got very involved in I forget what it's called now, the Colonization Society.
The American Colonization Society.
Which was, and became fairly senior in that organization.
He was one of the charter members.
Yeah, which was, do you mind just explaining what that idea was?
Yeah, and so this was the idea that this Meade and Wilmer, again, sort of working their magic, and what they tried to do, they saw this terrible problem. Meade was the one to write about it, and he would say, essentially, even at the end of his life, that slavery as an institution wasn't evil necessarily, but the way it was practiced was evil. But they came to the sense that it had to end. It really had to end. And so the solution that they and others came up with is send all the enslaved people back to Africa. And they picked out a place. Virginia gathered money to send their first missionary, Reverend Andrus, to do a scouting mission. Meade became the agent to raise money for the organization. So the bottom line was they believed that whites and blacks could not coexist, and the only way to solve slavery was to deport everyone. And, you know, it wasn't very long, 2 or 3 years, to everyone realized it was just a dismal failure because not all the people they were sending back came from that part of Africa. Most people by this time were born in the United States. It was just completely untenable, and they knew it.
Now, what's interesting is his theology isn't really vir media, is it? It's not. So vir media is a word often used of Anglican theology. It was actually coined originally by the Tractarians, and it describes our attempt to capture what the early church fathers were doing. So the ethos was, you know, on the one hand, those Roman Catholics in the 19th century were believing all those accretions like purgatory and Mariology, and the Reformed churches were just trying to get back to the Bible. We're the via media. So Anglicans are the tradition that occupies that space. It's living where the early church fathers were into the authentic Christianity. It's actually a very conceited claim, although the way it gets used today is differently. But the interesting thing about the Reverend Wilmer is that he's pretty reformed, rather than not much sacramentology.
I like to say he leaned heavily on the more Protestant side of our denomination, and I think that's fair and true, clearly true. But the amazing thing about him is, you know, he was elected 4 times as the president of the House of Deputies, which had many high church folks on it, and I think they were stymied that he was able. He might not have accepted the way that they expressed their faith, but he respected it. And I think he knew as well that there was far more that they held in common than what was separate. And clearly he was respected, or they would not have continued to elect him.
And he was actually quite innovative liturgically, wasn't he? Because the initial practice was basically there wasn't any congregational participation. That was partly because of illiteracy, is that right?
Yeah.
And he had the good idea that actually it might be quite nice if everybody says something. So just tell us a little bit about that side of him.
Yeah, so like when St. Paul's was built, there was a wall here and a pedestal pulpit, just like Christ Church still has, and a clerk's desk. So a clerk's desk and then the pulpit. So the officiant would stand in the top, for the most part. The clerk would stand at the desk, and essentially in those days, the priest would lead the service, and the clerk would respond. The congregation would just sort of sit and watch this happening. And so it was William Meade who had the great idea at Christ Church. He said, we have to make this alive. You know, they're competing with camp meetings, you know, so we have to make the liturgy more alive. And so he had the great ideas that they would train the children to learn the responses in the liturgy and to say them very loudly. And very soon, everyone was joining in. And remember, in those days, there weren't books of common prayer in the pews. You sort of had to either know the liturgy or the plaques. One was here, one was there. 10 Commandments, Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. Those were the 3 things you needed to know. If you needed to look up, they were right there in front of you. So they did enliven worship. And as opposed to their camp meeting siblings, they kept their sermons to a half an hour to an hour. They were staunch believers in the prayer book. They followed the prayer book. And so on Wednesday nights or other nights in the week, they had prayer meetings with less rigid formality. But they really believed that we already have the treasures of our own renewal. God has given them to us, given to the church for us to use. It's a matter for us to rediscover them. And the quote I begin the book with is that he believed that the world doesn't need a teacher, they need someone to help us remember what we already know to be true. So.
Now, the life was short, and there's so much death in his own life. He lost his first wife relatively young.
Very young, in their 20s.
Mm-hmm. And then married subsequently twice. And
she died giving birth to their 6th child.
And do we have any sense, just talk a little bit about the research you've embarked on here. I mean, do we have any insight? Did he keep a journal where he might talk about his feelings or anything like that? Do we have any hint about this side of
Yeah,
this
that's
man?
one of the issues of writing the book and doing the research is that he must have written thousands of letters. We have maybe a handful. He preached many, many sermons. There are 6 that we have. He did write an Episcopal manual, which was really the textbook and field guide for reviving the church in this new nation. And it went through 4 printings, and the last one 15 years after his death. So he could be given the claim of being the first American Anglican theologian. But that's been, thank heavens, he was recognized in his own day. And so with the stories that we have, the way he was recognized in his own day, and the fragments come together to tell a pretty remarkable story, but it's hard to do. And again, as opposed to Meade, who, not only do we have a photograph, but we have his diaries, we have his letters, we have his own autobiography, and his own history of Virginia. So, I mean, he wrote the narrative, and largely wrote Wilmer out of it. They were kind of frenemies.
Virginia Theological Seminary's got 4 paintings, portraits of Meade. So if you need one, we can share one with you. But that's so. Where are these sources? Were they in the archives of St. Paul's? Where did you have to travel to track some of them down?
Well, Corinne Maraska, right there. She did such a fine job and did amazing work. It's amazing what you can do sitting at a computer these days. But they came from all over. The archives of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the National Church archives, which, of course, since he was a national church leader, those records are all intact and accessible online, believe it or not. And so are the Diocese of Virginia. Where are you, Julie Randall? I give a big thanks to her, the archivist of the Diocese of Virginia, who works hard to keep that tradition going today. But it's a challenge of finding and keeping those records. So we searched everywhere we knew to search. And I have to say, before you hit the last send button on the book, this is the sort of the last draft that I'm holding in my hands. Before I did that, I took a pilgrimage. And I went to Williamsburg, to Bruton Parish, and the clergy there were so wonderful. Took me in the church. I wanted to make sure Wilmer was where I thought he was. And he's in the floor of the very narrow chancel there in Bruton Parish. So paid him a visit there. And remember, he was there for just over a year. And got buried in the chancel. And the town went into a season of mourning. They wore black armbands. In the era when it was such scarcity, they combined money and resources in the community to give him a burial they thought was proper. It was kind of amazing to think in that short of time he made that kind of impact on the community. One of his colleagues at the time said if he'd lived any longer, there'd be only one church in Williamsburg. Pretty amazing. And then I went from there to Richmond, to the Monumental Church. Has anyone been to the Monumental Church in Richmond or heard a bit of its story? It's an amazing story. It's a book for another time, but I'll give you the quick version. So you think that Richmond was a city of about 11,000 at the time. Half of the population was enslaved, so let's go to maybe 600. There was a theater on Broad Street in December 26, 1811, so there were 600 people there and a terrible fire, devastating fire. It started backstage. The last person left the fire 6 minutes after the fire started. It happened quickly, and many of Richmond's elite were killed in that fire because the people on the ground floor could get out the exits, but the box seats, the stairwell collapsed in the fire, and so they had to essentially jump out the windows. But the point of the story is that the entire city of Richmond saw that fire, interpreted it immediately as an act of God, that they should not have been at the theater in the first place. So they buried the 73 people in the crypt and built a church on top of it called the Monumental Church. And so many of the leading folks were Episcopalian at the time. It was decided it would be an Episcopal church. And so it was the founding of that church that allowed Bishop Richard Channing Moore to come and to actually have a salary because he was the rector of that church. And William Holland Wilmer preached the inaugural sermon at that church. It was the diocesan convention. It really was the launch of this revival movement. And it's in the sermon that he preached that day. He talked about renewing Zion, our beloved Zion, and really set the theme for all of the other reformers. So every diocesan convention after that, Richard Channing Moore essentially gave a Zion update. Here's where we are. Here how things are happening.
And the Zion theme, Rebuilding Zion, is the title of the book. And you've structured the entire book in terms of chapter headings around the Zion theme. I found that such an intriguing way of doing it. You know, traditionally you get books of this nature are largely chronological. You know.
I didn't want to do that, so I needed another structure. I needed another way to hang it, and Psalm 126 is perfect. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, then were we like those who dream. What a great way to start, and how inspiring. And it was clearly, they loved the Psalms of Ascents. That was their favorite part of the Psalter, and mostly because of that Zion. You know, we're going up to Zion. We're going to the house of God. We're renewing our faith.
And that was his motivation. Front and central was that renewal of faith for the age in which he was living. As, in a very real sense, his successor, do you find yourself in awe? I mean, one has to take into account the sin of participating and supporting the cruel institution of the enslavement of people. And at the same time, you got this young life and all these institutions he's created, a slight austerity and seriousness, but a magic in terms of devotion and affection. So as you sit back, and if somebody said to you, give us the 2-sentence summary of this guy.
He set the DNA for this place, and I'm very clear about that. We've always had the focus of being centered, understanding our mission here as making disciples. We are to shape and form and make disciples to be sent out into the world, and our work is to serve that world, to be out in it and to engage people outside of these doors. And I think those are the two things that we can credit William Holland Wilmer. I say in the book, I start every morning in this chapel where was his office at the time. I spend most of my days in Wilmer Hall, the building named for him, and I serve this remarkable congregation. And when you think about, what his legacy is, I mean, just look around us. It's this. And if you go to stand in the middle of the Grover Virginia Seminary and think, gosh, amazing, what a legacy. He clearly was a force.
Our time is up, but can I just say, I was joshing earlier when I accused you of being a slacker and not. But can I also say that for a leader of a congregation to find the time and space to do a project of this scale, to capture it, to write it, to reflect on it, not only brings to the continuing leadership of a congregation a sort of freshness and a sensitivity to history and the present and the potential for the future, but it also reflects on your own extraordinary depth as a rector and as a Christian. So please, let's acknowledge the achievement of Orrin Warder.